Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. Today's episode is inspired by you, our amazing listeners. You suggest the topics, and we dive deep to bring you valuable insights. So let's get started.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This human drive to try and understand why people do what they do, especially when those behaviors fall outside of what we consider normal.
Oh, absolutely. And, for you, our learner, that curiosity probably extends to some of the more complex or even unsettling aspects of human behavior.
Like why some people seem to lack a conscience, or why others thrive in chaos while most of us just try to avoid it.
Exactly. And that leads us to our deep dive today. We're going to explore psychopathy, but not in the way you might think.
Forget those sensationalized Hollywood portrayals of psychopaths as sadistic criminals. We're going to move way beyond those stereotypes.
We're going to challenge some preconceived notions and hopefully come away with a more nuanced understanding of this complex condition.
Our guide for this exploration is Kevin Dutton's book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths, a really thought-provoking look at the spectrum of psychopathy and its unexpected manifestations.
We'll be working from a YouTube audiobook transcript, which gives us a great overview of Dutton's research and some really interesting real-life examples.
So think of this as a journey into the heart of what makes psychopaths tick, what sets them apart, and surprisingly, what we might even learn from them.
Now, one of the things that really struck me early on in Dutton's book was how he chose to introduce the concept of psychopathy.
Yeah, it's not your typical academic approach, is it?
Not at all. He starts by talking about his own father, a nonviolent psychopath.
Yeah, that phrase itself, nonviolent psychopath, kind of makes you stop and rethink everything you thought you knew about psychopathy, right?
It certainly does. We tend to immediately associate psychopathy with violence and criminality, but Dutton paints a very different picture of his dad.
He describes him as charming, fearless, and ruthless, but also successful.
Yeah, he even compares him to scheming Del Boy from the British sitcom Only Fools and Horses. You know, that classic market trader who always has an angle, always looking for a deal.
And it's this sort of opportunistic cunning that Dutton highlights throughout the book, the ability to see and seize opportunities where others see only problems or limitations.
And he illustrates this perfectly with the anecdote about the 11-month date books.
Oh, that's brilliant. Tell us about that one.
Okay, so Dutton and his father were selling these date books, but there was a bit of a problem. They were missing the month of January.
Oops, sounds like a recipe for disaster.
You'd think so, right? But his father turned it into a unique selling point.
Hold on. How do you spin missing January into a positive?
Well, he framed it as a special limited edition, offered a 2-for-1 deal, and even promised customers a free extra month the following year.
Wow, talk about turning a lemon into lemonade.
Exactly, and they sold out every single date book.
No, that's a perfect example of how some of the traits we often associate with psychopathy, that fearlessness, that ruthlessness, that ability to think outside the box, can actually be incredibly adaptive in certain contexts.
It really makes you question those hard and fast categories we tend to put people into, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It challenges our assumptions and suggests that maybe these traits aren't inherently good or bad, but rather depend on how they're channeled and the situations they're applied to.
Now let's talk about emotions for a moment. When we think about the human experience, we generally agree that there are certain basic emotions that we all share.
Things like fear, sadness, joy, anger. Those are universal, aren't they?
Exactly. They're fundamental to how we navigate the world, how we connect with each other.
We feel them intensely in certain situations, like when we're facing a threat or experiencing loss.
But here's where things get really interesting with psychopathy.
It turns out that psychopaths might be the exception to this rule.
They don't seem to experience these core emotions in the same way that most people do.
Dutton describes it as a kind of no clouds, only silver linings perspective.
They don't dwell on the negative or get bogged down by fear or sadness in the same way that most of us do.
It's like they have a built-in emotional filter that screens out all of the negativity.
Remember that anecdote about the 11-month diaries? That's a perfect example of this ability to reframe a potentially negative situation into something positive.
It's not necessarily about positive thinking in the traditional sense, but rather about a lack of a negative emotional response in the first place.
Now, this is where it's so important for you, our learner, to really shift your perspective on psychopathy.
Yeah, we need to move beyond those stereotypical images of psychopaths as cold-blooded killers like Hannibal Lecter or Ted Bundy.
Absolutely. While those individuals certainly exist, Dutton makes it very clear that psychopathy is not synonymous with violence.
It's not a one-size-fits-all label.
In fact, psychopaths exist in all walks of life, often blending in seamlessly with the rest of us.
You might even have encountered some without realizing it.
Think about it. Surgeons who remain calm and focused during life-saving operations.
Soldiers who can make split-second decisions under intense pressure.
Entrepreneurs who are willing to take big risks and challenge conventional thinking.
Even spies and lawyers who can detach emotionally and navigate high-stakes situations with a clear head.
The key takeaway here is that those very traits we might typically associate with psychopathy, like fearlessness, ruthlessness, and a lack of empathy, can actually be incredibly valuable in certain professions and contexts.
They can even serve to benefit society as a whole. Think of that surgeon who can operate with a steady hand, even in the most challenging circumstances.
Now, let's talk about the brain for a moment. We often assume that there must be some obvious structural difference in the brains of psychopaths that explains their unique way of processing the world.
It seems logical, right?
Eh-eh.
If their behavior is so different, wouldn't their brains reflect that?
Exactly. But as Dutton points out, the early research in this area yielded some surprising results.
He talks about the work of Dr. Morrison, who initially found no significant physical differences in the brains of psychopaths compared to those without psychopathic traits.
That's fascinating. So their brains look essentially the same on a structural level.
But Dr. Morrison made a crucial distinction. He pointed out that there's a huge difference between a dead brain and a living one.
Meaning that the way the brain functions, how its different parts interact and communicate, that's what really matters.
Think of it like a computer. The hardware might look identical, but the software running on it determines what it can do and how it behaves.
It's those subtle differences in the internal wiring and the brain's chemistry that might hold the key to understanding psychopathy.
And those differences can arise from a whole host of factors: upbringing, early experiences, even random variations in development.
So it's not necessarily a case of being born with a psychopath brain, but rather a combination of nature and nurture shaping these unique neural pathways.
And this brings us to the fascinating work of Robert Hare, a true pioneer in the study of psychopathy.
Dutton discusses a research paper that Hare submitted that looked at the brain activity of psychopaths during something called a lexical decision task.
Now, before you get lost in the jargon, let me explain this in simpler terms.
Yeah, break it down for us.
Okay, so in a lexical decision task, you're basically shown strings of letters very quickly, and you have to decide as fast as you can whether those letters form a real word or not.
Seems simple enough.
It is, but here's the interesting part. Researchers have found that most people react differently to words with emotional content.
Meaning that words like love or hate might grab our attention more quickly than neutral words like table or chair.
Exactly. Those emotionally charged words seem to have a kind of priority in our brains. They stand out more.
But Hare's research showed that this wasn't the case for psychopaths.
For them, words loaded with emotion like cancer or murder didn't elicit any faster response than completely neutral words.
It's as if their brains weren't registering the emotional weight of those words at all.
Which is incredible when you think about it.
It really suggests that they're processing emotional information on a completely different level.
And you know what's even more remarkable? The scientific journal that Hare submitted this paper to initially rejected it.
Seriously, why?
Because some of the EEG patterns, those recordings of electrical activity in the brain, were so unusual, so different from what they expected to see in a normal person, that they thought the data must be flawed.
But it wasn't flawed, was it?
Not at all. It was a genuine reflection of how psychopaths' brains were processing information in this very unique way.
Talk about a paradigm shift for those researchers.
It really challenged their assumptions about what constitutes normal brain activity.
And this leads Dutton to delve into the different types of brain waves, particularly theta waves,
which are typically associated with states of relaxation, drowsiness, even sleep.
Yeah, when we're winding down or drifting off.
But here's the fascinating thing. Research suggests that theta waves can actually be present in psychopaths during normal waking hours.
Wait, so their brains are operating in a kind of relaxed state even when they're fully alert?
It seems so, and sometimes even during periods of heightened awareness or when they're engaged in tasks that would typically induce stress or anxiety in most people.
It's as if their brains are idling at a different speed when it comes to emotional processing.
Precisely, they're not revving up in the same way that our brains do when we're confronted with emotionally charged situations.
And this seems to tie into the idea that for psychopaths, language itself can be quite shallow.
Meaning that their words might not carry the same emotional weight that we would typically associate with them.
A psychopath might say, "I love you," but internally those words might hold the same emotional significance as saying, "I'll have a cup of coffee."
It's just a string of words without that deeper layer of emotional meaning.
Which again goes a long way in explaining their often remarked coolness under pressure and their very strong reward-driven behavior.
Their brains are less switched on in the emotional sense, so those emotional cues and signals that might derail or distract, most of us just don't have the same impact on them.
Now let's shift gears a little and explore this intriguing concept of a predatory gaze.
Ah, yes. That almost chilling ability that some psychopaths seem to possess to identify vulnerability in others.
It's the kind of thing that makes you think of those stories about predators like Ted Bundy, who could seemingly sense weakness in their victims.
And while those anecdotal accounts are certainly compelling, there's actually some scientific evidence to back up this idea.
Dutton talks about Angela Book's research, which found that individuals who scored high on measures of psychopathic traits were actually better at judging how vulnerable someone was simply by observing the way they walked.
Just from their gait, really.
Exactly, and this was true for both university students who scored high on psychopathy scales and individuals with a clinical diagnosis of psychopathy.
So it seems to be a consistent pattern across different populations.
And what's even more fascinating is that the clinical psychopaths in Book's study were consciously aware of what they were looking for.
They could explicitly articulate the cues and signals that indicated someone might be an easier target.
It's almost like they have a built-in vulnerability radar.
Which raises some really interesting questions about the origins of this ability. Is it an evolved survival mechanism? A skill honed through experience? Or perhaps a combination of both?
It certainly is a thought-provoking area of research and one that highlights the complex interplay between nature and nurture in shaping human behavior.
Dutton also explores the flip side of this, our own innate ability to detect psychopaths.
So we might have our own version of a psychopath radar.
It seems so. Reed Malloy conducted an experiment where he surveyed professionals working in criminal justice and mental health and found that a significant number of them reported experiencing very specific physical reactions when they were interviewing individuals with psychopathic traits.
What kind of reactions?
Things like the hair stood up on the back of my neck or my skin crawled. Kind of visceral, intuitive response.
Interesting. So it's not just a cognitive assessment, it's a gut feeling.
Exactly. And interestingly, these reactions were reported more frequently by female clinicians and those with less professional experience.
Perhaps suggesting that women might be more attuned to these subtle social cues.
Or that those who haven't yet developed a thick skin through years of exposure to difficult personalities are more sensitive to these kinds of red flags.
It's almost like we have an inherent alarm system that goes off when we encounter someone who might be a threat, even if we can't quite articulate why.
Which is fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. It suggests that this ability to detect potential danger, even on a subconscious level, could have played a significant role in our survival as a species.
Now, one of the key distinctions that Dutton makes in his book is the difference between hot and cold empathy.
Which is crucial for understanding how psychopaths relate to others.
Absolutely. He uses the classic thought experiment of the railway trolley problem to illustrate
Oh,
that.
the one where you have to choose between saving one person or 5 people by pulling a lever.
Exactly. And it turns out that our responses to this kind of moral dilemma can reveal a lot about how we process empathy.
Most people struggle with this decision on an emotional level. They feel the weight of those lives and the potential consequences of their actions.
But psychopaths tend to approach this dilemma much more rationally.
For them, it's a simple cost-benefit analysis, devoid of that intense emotional turmoil.
And this difference highlights the distinction between hot empathy and cold empathy.
Hot empathy is that gut-level feeling of actually experiencing another person's emotions as if they were your own.
It's that deep sense of connection and shared experience.
Whereas cold empathy is more of a cognitive understanding of what another person might be thinking or feeling without necessarily feeling those emotions yourself.
It's more of an intellectual exercise, a detached assessment of another person's mental state.
And the prevailing theory is that psychopaths might be deficient in hot empathy. They lack that visceral emotional connection to others.
But they can actually excel in cold empathy.
Meaning they can understand other people's thoughts, intentions, and even their vulnerabilities, perhaps even better than most people.
But without feeling any of the associated emotions.
Exactly. It's a purely cognitive exercise for them.
And you can imagine how this ability to read people without being clouded by emotion could be incredibly valuable in certain situations.
Especially in areas like persuasion or negotiation, where understanding another person's motivations and weaknesses can be a real advantage.
It's about knowing how to push the right buttons, so to speak.
Now, this naturally leads to the question of psychopathy and success. We tend to associate psychopathy with criminal behavior. But Dutton presents a much more nuanced view.
He argues that psychopathic traits can actually be found in many successful individuals across various fields.
He cites research by Belinda Board and Katerina Fritzen, who found that certain psychopathic attributes like superficial charm, persuasiveness, a lack of empathy, independence, and a strong focus were actually more common in business leaders than in individuals classified as disturbed criminals.
Wait, so these successful CEOs and entrepreneurs might share some key traits with criminals?
It seems so. The crucial difference, according to Board and Fritzen, boils down to the level of antisocial behavior.
Meaning that the criminals in their study showed much higher levels of things like law-breaking aggression and impulsivity.
Whereas the successful individuals were able to channel those other traits in more socially acceptable ways.
So it's not about the presence or absence of these traits, but rather how they're expressed and controlled.
Exactly. Dutton uses the analogy of a mixing desk, where the levels of different psychopathic traits can be adjusted like dials and sliders, leading to a vast range of possible outcomes.
So someone with high levels of charm and focus, but low levels of impulsivity and aggression might be well suited for a leadership role.
While someone with the opposite combination might be more prone to criminal behavior.
And this idea of a spectrum rather than a black and white category is supported by brain imaging studies.
Research by Mehmet Mamet has shown that the differences in brain function between criminal and non-criminal psychopaths appear to be dimensional, meaning differences in degree, rather than discrete, meaning fundamentally different categories.
So it's a continuum, not a clear-cut division.
And this is further illustrated by a thought experiment that Dutton conducted with a group of undergraduate students.
Tell me about it.
He asked them to imagine an individual who was ruthless, fearless, charming, amoral, and highly focused, and then he asked them what professions might suit this person.
And what did they come up with?
The list included CEO, spy surgeon, politician, and military personnel.
Interesting. So roles that require a certain degree of detachment, risk-taking, and the ability to make tough decisions.
Exactly. It challenges the notion that these traits are inherently negative.
And it suggests that perhaps society even needs individuals who possess these qualities to some extent.
To push boundaries, challenge the status quo, and operate effectively in high-stakes environments.
Now let's talk about psychopathy in extreme environments. Dutton even raises the intriguing possibility of sending psychopaths into space.
Now that's a thought-provoking idea.
The rationale being that their legendary coolness under pressure and their ability to detach emotionally might make them ideally suited for the challenges of space travel.
Makes sense when you think about the intense stress and potential dangers involved.
And there's some experimental evidence to back this up. Dutton describes a study where participants were exposed to fear sweat, the kind of sweat we produce when we're genuinely terrified.
Oh, not exactly the most pleasant experimental condition.
True, but it yielded some fascinating results. Individuals with psychopathic traits remained remarkably unfazed by the fear sweat and were more willing to take risks even when they were experiencing physiological signs of fear.
So their bodies might be reacting to the threat, but their minds aren't letting it get to them.
It's like they have a built-in neurological immune system with a zero-tolerance policy on anxiety.
Which is incredible, really. It suggests a remarkable level of resilience and a disconnect between the typical physiological and psychological responses to stress.
And this all leads us to the core concept of Dutton's book, The Wisdom of Psychopaths.
Which is a provocative title, isn't it?
It certainly is. It suggests that there's something valuable, something we can learn from individuals who possess these traits.
Dutton argues that psychopathy isn't inherently good or bad, but rather a tool like a high-performance sports car?
So it's all about who's behind the wheel and how they choose to use it.
Exactly. In the right hands with the right intentions, a psychopath's unique abilities can be incredibly beneficial.
But in the wrong hands, those same traits can lead to destructive outcomes.
And a key characteristic of psychopaths that seems to contribute to both their successes and their failings is their lack of concern for what others think of them.
They're not bound by social conventions or the need for approval in the same way that most people are.
Which can be incredibly liberating in some ways,
Yeah.
but also incredibly dangerous in others.
It's that classic double-edged sword again.
Now, it's important to remember that psychopathy isn't a black and white condition. It exists on a spectrum.
There's a wide range of expressions and manifestations.
Dutton uses the image of a subway map with inner and outer zones to illustrate this.
So we might all fall somewhere along this continuum of psychopathic traits, with only a small minority residing in that extreme inner city of the disorder as we typically understand it.
Exactly. We see examples ranging from those ice-cold traders in the financial world who are highly functional but perhaps lack deep emotional connections to individuals who exhibit violently antisocial behavior and everything in between.
And there's no clear-cut dividing line. It's more like a gradual transition, like the difference between a casual weekend golfer and a world-class professional like Tiger Woods.
Both possess the basic skills, but the level of mastery and the specific context in which they apply those skills are vastly different.
And this ties back to the analogy of the mixing desk with those different dials and sliders representing various psychopathic traits.
Different combinations and varying levels of these traits create a unique profile for each individual.
And as we discussed earlier, certain professions like surgery seem to benefit from having certain traits like fearlessness and intense focus turned up.
While those same traits might be detrimental in other contexts,
And this understanding of psychopathy as a spectrum has some very practical implications even for fields like law enforcement.
Dutton even recounts his own small experiment, where he found that individuals who scored higher on psychopathic traits were better at identifying a guilty individual who is attempting to conceal a small object.
Sort of like a real-life lie detector test,
Exactly. They were more attuned to those subtle cues and behaviors that betray deception.
which suggests that this psychopath radar, this enhanced ability to detect vulnerability and deception, could be a valuable asset in certain settings.
Like airport security or customs, where identifying individuals with malicious intent is crucial.
It's a reminder that even traits typically associated with negative outcomes can have their uses.
Now let's talk about this fascinating concept of functional psychopathy.
This refers to individuals who possess a number of psychopathic traits but manage to channel them in ways that are not overtly antisocial or criminal.
They function effectively in society, often achieving significant success without leaving a trail of victims in their wake.
The research of Scott Lilienfeld has been really important in distinguishing between what he calls successful and unsuccessful psychopaths.
It's not just about the traits themselves, but how those traits are expressed and utilized.
And the Psychopathic Personality Inventory, or PPI, is a tool that focuses on those core underlying personality traits rather than just on a history of antisocial behavior.
So things like self-centered impulsivity, fearless dominance, and cold-heartedness.
It allows for a more nuanced and comprehensive assessment of the psychopathic personality.
And this broader understanding is crucial because it helps us to recognize that psychopathy isn't just confined to the criminal world.
It exists on a continuum with many individuals exhibiting these traits to varying degrees without ever engaging in criminal activity.
And Joseph Newman offers another important perspective on this. He cautions against using the term psychopath, too broadly arguing that it can lead to misunderstandings and oversimplifications.
He emphasizes this idea of emotional tunnel vision in individuals with psychopathic traits.
Meaning that when they become intensely focused on a particular goal or reward, they tend to block out emotional information that isn't directly relevant to that goal.
It's like they have laser-sharp focus and everything else just fades into the background.
Exactly. And he demonstrated this bountifully with his mislabeled images experiment.
Remind me how that one worked.
Participants were shown pictures that were labeled with incongruent words. For example, a picture of a cute puppy might be labeled with the word sad, or a picture of a delicious cake might be labeled with the word disgusting.
And the idea is that most people would be distracted by that mismatch.
Exactly. Their brains would register the incongruity, and it would slow down their response time when asked to name the picture.
But psychopaths weren't as affected, were they?
Not at all. They were actually faster at naming the pictures because they weren't getting bogged down by that emotional dissonance.
It's like their brains were just filtering out the irrelevant information and zeroing in on the task at hand.
Which again points to their incredibly goal-oriented mindset and their ability to block out distractions.
Now, Newman's research also found an interesting pattern in the scores on the PCLR, the Psychopathy Checklist Revised.
A widely used tool for assessing psychopathic traits.
He noticed a kind of abrupt shift in response patterns around a score of 28 to 30.
Suggesting that there might be a qualitative difference at that clinical threshold.
So not just a gradual increase in traits, but a kind of tipping point where things shift dramatically.
Exactly, and this is further supported by his electric shock experiment.
The one where participants were anticipating receiving a shock?
Yes, and what they found was that while psychopaths did show less anticipatory anxiety when their attention was deliberately drawn away from the threat of the shock, they actually became more agitated when the threat was made unavoidable.
So it's not a complete absence of emotion, but rather a selective insensitivity.
Exactly, as if they can switch off their emotional responses when it suits their purpose. But those emotions can still surface when they're forced to confront them head on.
which again highlights the complexity of this condition.
It's not a simple on or off switch. It's a multifaceted interplay of factors that can manifest in different ways depending on the context.
Now, if psychopathy can be so seemingly maladaptive, why has it persisted throughout human evolution?
It's a good question, right? You'd think that traits that lead to antisocial behavior and a lack of empathy would be selected against.
But as Dutton points out, there might be an evolutionary advantage to psychopathy in certain
He
situations.
delves into what he calls the mathematics of madness to explore this.
Okay, so math and madness, what's the connection?
Well, Dutton draws on game theory, which is a mathematical framework for understanding strategic decision-making in competitive situations.
Interesting. So how does that apply to psychopathy?
Well, he uses the classic game of chicken scenario from the movie Rebel Without a Cause as an example.
The one where two cars race towards each other and the first one to swerve is the chicken.
Exactly. And in this kind of high-stakes, winner-take-all situation, having a reputation for ruthlessness can actually be an advantage.
If your opponent believes that you're willing to go all the way, that you won't back down, they're more likely to swerve first.
And you win without even having to risk a head-on collision.
So in a world where resources are scarce and competition is fierce, having a touch of psychopathy might actually increase your chances of survival and reproductive success.
At least that's the theory, and it makes a certain amount of
What-
sense.
It's that idea that sometimes the best defense is a good offense.
Now, even cooperative strategies like the tit-for-tat strategy, which is known to lead to stable and mutually beneficial interactions, can have what Dutton calls psychopathic elements.
How so?
Well, it involves an initial display of cooperation and trustworthiness, but also a willingness to retaliate swiftly and ruthlessly if the other party betrays that trust.
So it's a combination of charm and aggression,
Exactly, a kind of nice guy but don't mess with me approach.
which suggests that even in cooperative contexts, a dash of psychopathy might be beneficial for maintaining social order and deterring exploitation.
And Dutton goes even further, suggesting that perhaps society as a whole needs individuals who are willing to take risks, break the rules, and challenge the status quo.
The entrepreneurs, the innovators, the revolutionaries.
Exactly, those who aren't afraid to shake things up and push boundaries.
Now, to really bring these concepts to life, Dutton shares some really compelling personal anecdotes, particularly about his lifelong friendship with a man he calls Johnny, whom he identifies as having psychopathic traits.
Oh, I love those stories.
Yeah.
They really illustrate those psychopathic tendencies in a way that's both fascinating and unsettling.
Absolutely. He tells the story about how Johnny managed to solve a complex star puzzle in a matter of minutes while everyone else was struggling for hours.
Yeah, and how he manipulated his way into getting an A on a history paper despite not having written a single word of it.
And who could forget the story about how he convinced their parents to let them stay up late on New Year's Eve using a combination of charm, logic, and a complete disregard for the rules.
Classic Johnny there.
And despite all of these questionable behaviors, Johnny ends up being quite successful. He joins MI5, the British Security Service, and thrives in that high-pressure environment.
Which again highlights how those same traits that can be so problematic in some contexts can actually be assets in others.
Now let's turn our attention to the world of finance, where psychopathic traits might be particularly prevalent.
Oh yes, the cutthroat world of high-stakes decision-making,
Yeah.
where the potential rewards are enormous and the risks are equally high.
The research in this area is really fascinating. Dutton talks about Babashev's work on individuals who carry the so-called warrior gene, the MAOAL polymorphism.
Which has been linked to increased aggression and risk-taking behavior.
Exactly. And Schiff found that these individuals tend to make consistently optimal choices in risky financial situations.
So they're not just reckless, they're calculated risk takers.
And Bob Hare's own research on business executives revealed a surprisingly high prevalence of psychopathic traits among them.
Which often correlated with positive attributes like charisma presentation skills, creativity, strategic thinking, and communication abilities.
Qualities that are highly valued in the corporate world.
And a study by Board and Fritzen compared CEOs to inmates at Broadmoor High Security Hospital and found that the CEOs actually scored higher on certain psychopathic attributes.
So the line between the boardroom and the prison cell might be thinner than we think.
It's all about how those traits are channeled and controlled.
And Paul Bobiak offers a rather chilling perspective, suggesting that individuals with psychopathic traits might actually thrive in organizational chaos, using it as an opportunity to manipulate and climb the corporate ladder.
He even goes so far as to propose that those who might have contributed to economic crises could be the very ones best positioned to exploit the aftermath for their own gain.
So the same lack of empathy and disregard for consequences that can lead to financial ruin for others might actually benefit them personally.
It's a disturbing thought, but one that's worth considering.
Now, the concept of a vulnerability radar comes up again here this time, through the insights of a successful con man named Philip Morant.
Who emphasizes the importance of having a good vulnerability radar for his particular line of work.
And his methods, which included carefully cultivated self-disclosure and strategic use of rapid distraction to exploit people's emotional weaknesses, echo Angela Book's findings about psychopaths' ability to detect vulnerability.
It highlights the manipulative potential of this ability to read people and identify their weaknesses.
And research by El Aharoni on inmates found that moderate levels of psychopathy actually predicted greater criminal success, meaning they were involved in more crimes, but were also less likely to be convicted.
So their coolness under pressure and their ability to detach emotionally might actually give them an edge in the criminal world.
And Helena Nyholm observed that psychopathic offenders often appear more convincing when expressing remorse, even though they're probably not genuinely feeling it.
Which is a chilling thought, the ability to mimic emotions and manipulate people's perceptions.
Although Stephen Porter argues that this display of remorse might be a calculated tactic used to influence sentencing or parole hearings.
It's a reminder that we can't always take what we see at face value, especially when dealing with individuals who might be masters of manipulation.
And research using techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, has shown that it's possible to temporarily reduce moral inhibition and enhance lying ability by targeting specific areas of the brain,
Like the anterior prefrontal cortex.
which suggests that the capacity for deception might be hardwired into our brains to some extent.
And brain imaging studies have revealed structural differences in the brains of psychopaths compared to non-psychopaths.
Including reduced gray matter and altered integrity in the uncinate fasciculus, which connects the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala.
Providing further evidence that these differences in behavior might have a neurological basis.
Now, Dutton explores this fascinating and often blurry line between the hero and the psychopath, using the character of Buzz Rickson from the film The War Lover as a compelling example.
Rickson is an arrogant, fearless pilot who's incredibly effective in combat, but also deeply unsettling in his ruthlessness.
He embodies that duality of traits that can make someone both a hero and a villain.
And the fact that Special Forces soldiers often score high on measures of fearless dominance, which is a key component of psychopathy, further blurs this line.
It suggests that in certain extreme situations, those same traits that can lead to destructive outcomes in civilian life might actually be essential for survival and success.
And research by Adrian Rain using a learning task experiment showed that individuals with psychopathic traits tend to be slower to learn from punishment, but much quicker to learn when a reward is offered alongside the avoidance of punishment.
So they're highly motivated by potential gains, but less responsive to negative consequences.
Which makes sense when you consider their reward-driven nature and their relative lack of fear and anxiety.
And the research on the dopamine reward system by Joshua Buchholz at Vanderbilt University provides a neurological basis for this.
He found that individuals with high psychopathic traits release significantly more dopamine in response to amphetamine, suggesting a heightened sensitivity to reward.
So their brains are wired to seek out pleasure and gratification.
And David Zald suggests that this strong draw to reward can overwhelm any concerns they might have about potential risks.
The potential payoff simply outweighs the perceived danger.
And even the field of forensic linguistics has yielded some insights into the motivations of psychopaths.
Through the analysis of language patterns in their speech and writing?
Exactly. Jeff Hancock analyzed accounts given by murderers and found that psychopaths tend to use more words related to their basic physical needs and are more likely to provide justifications for their actions.
Again, reinforcing this idea that they're primarily driven by self-interest and the pursuit of reward, often at any cost.
Now let's talk about fearlessness in psychopaths. The traditional view was that their lack of fear was due to a dysfunction in the amygdala, the part of the brain that processes emotions like fear.
But as Dutton points out, more recent research has challenged this view.
Studies using brain imaging have shown that psychopaths actually show increased activity in visual and dorsolateral prefrontal cortexes during emotion recognition tasks,
Suggesting a more cognitive approach to emotions.
One individual with psychopathic traits described it as being colorblind at a traffic light. They can recognize the signal, but they don't experience the associated feeling in the same way.
So they can see the fear on someone's face, but they don't feel it themselves. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and be sure to like, comment, and subscribe.
And let us know what you'd like us to explore next.
We'll see you next time.